Hello, everyone. I'm Brent Bisking. Welcome to I want to submit my research, but I don't know where to start. Our last webinar in the Coffee Talk webinars. Like I said, I'm Brent Bisking. I'm a program manager for recruitment and engagement here at PAEA. And I'm going to hand it off to Dr. Denise Rizzo.
Thanks, Brent. Hi, everyone. I'm Denise Rizzo. I'm the managing editor of JPAE, and I'm the director of research and publication at PAEA. So thank you for coming today. This is our sixth session of our webinar series. And once again, it is, I want to submit my dissertation, but where do I start? And we have the pleasure of having Dr. Mary Warner here today, who is the chair and also the associate professor of PA studies in the School of Medicine and Health Sciences at GW University, and we're excited to have her here to talk to all of us. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mary. And Mary, do you want to share your slides?
Yes, I will share my slides.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Warner.
Oh, it says sharing's not turned in. It's turned on.
Brent, you want to?
Try it now.
Okay, there we go. Okay. All right, can you see my slides? Or yes?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to the webinar Coffee Talk series. I love the name of the session. We'll talk about submitting your research and how do you get started. So the goals of this session are to identify key differences between sorry, I have to move this out of my way, a dissertation and a publishable manuscript, and then also to understand how to narrow the focus of the dissertation for journal submission, and also to recognize how to align your work with appropriate publication outlets and journals. So this is me. You've already seen that. So the problem is that you are an expert in your field, and there's lots of evidence of that. You've been hours upon hours reading, probably too numerous to count. You've spent months and years thinking about what you've read. You've been writing about the topic, and your results are really important and they need to be disseminated. However, journals will not accept your complete dissertation or capstone for submission. So I'm going to frame this a little bit differently in thinking about the problem based on the journal's interests and your interests. So you'll notice that you both are in the journal and you are interested in educating the readers on the topic. The journal's interests include making sure that the submissions fit the publication, and we'll be talking more about that. And your interests are that you just need to publish your capstone and your dissertation one way or the other. Another element that the journals have as an interest is making sure the content is targeted to the readers. And it does want the writer to identify or understand what the readers know and need to know. And your interests are you want to show the reader the importance of your new knowledge, and that proves that you're now an expert. The journal is interested in publishing sound methodology, and you're interested in submitting sound methodology, so it gets published. The journal's interests include showcasing the quality projects because it enhances the status of the journal. And your interests are using this publication and peer-reviewed recognition. So for promotion, invitations to symposia, and to become an expert, to be recognized as an expert. And both the journal and you have the interest of getting and or submitting and also accepting the submissions efficiently. So now I'm going to turn to the fit. And the fit that I'm talking about here is the font size, the length of the title, the length of the abstract, the length of the body of the manuscript, how many diagrams, how many tables you can have, and in some cases, there's limit on the number of references they want, depending on the type of journal article. So these sound like really sort of mundane logistical things that are not important, but they are critically important because when you submit your article, if it doesn't fit the criteria that they have given you, essentially the recipe, you may get what's called a desk rejection. And that means that the person who receives the article identifies that instead of the manuscript being 4,000 words, it's 12,000 words. You have 9,000 references. I'm making it up, of course. But they say, well, this is too long for our journal. And they just write you a message back saying, thank you for your submission. Your submission has been rejected. And that means that no one read your article except the person who looked at it and looked to see if it met the criteria. And so it's important to recognize that these elements really are important. And we'll talk a little bit more about a full research article versus a research brief. But that becomes very important because a research brief is very short. It's maybe 1,200 words with 10 references, one or two tables, whereas a full article is 4,000 words, and it depends on the journal. You have to pay attention to that. But you may have the ability to have four tables or four diagrams. Okay. The next thing I wanted to focus in on a little bit is what is it meant by content targeted to the readers? And this is what the journal wants to make sure that what you're talking about and what your article is about is germane to the readers that they have and important. And so the way to find out what content they're looking for, it depends on the journal. And so you need to read the descriptions of the journal, the goals of the journal, maybe look at some article titles or read some of the articles to confirm that your manuscript aligns with some of the other articles. And we'll talk more about this on slide 12. Knowing your audience is very important because if, for example, and I'll use a very simple example, in PA education, I would say that most educators know what Bloom's taxonomy is. So if one of your frames for your research project was the goal was to increase the quality of instruction, and so you wanted to focus in on improving the instruction by looking at the Bloom's taxonomy related to your learning objectives or instructional objectives, and move them to a higher order. You don't have to explain much more about that in the methodology section because most educators who've given a lecture have had to look at their own learning objectives and use Bloom's taxonomy to try to advance the knowledge and higher order thinking. But if that same article, you didn't want to publish it in JPAE, but you wanted to try to publish it for some reason in JAPA, the JAPA audience is practicing clinical PAs, and they probably don't know what Bloom's taxonomy is or have never used it. So in that instance, you need to write a paragraph about what Bloom's taxonomy is, why it's important, and so on. This is a simple example and also a terrible example. And the reason I say that is that if you're writing an article about Bloom's taxonomy that includes Bloom's taxonomy, it's probably not appropriate or germane to JAPA. And the editor of JAPA would probably say, if you have to mention Bloom's taxonomy, sounds like an educationally relevant article, and this should be published in JPAE or some other educational journal. It's important to know what is the audience's common knowledge versus knowledge that you have to expound upon. And so if you're bringing forward a theory that is probably less well known, or you're comparing two theories, one of which is well known and the other one isn't, you might need to provide a little background information so that the reader can understand why you used this frame. And sometimes you omit details because it's not relevant at all to the audience. And this is hard because if you've completed a dissertation and you had to talk about the theoretical framework for 10 pages, you probably don't want, as the author, don't want to let go of that really important information that was required for your thesis or your dissertation, but it's actually not at all important for understanding the study. So thinking about that is really important. And at one point, early on, a few years ago, I read an article that was submitted to JPAE, and it was about 26 pages long. And there were 5 to 10 pages on this. It looked like it was dissertation material about the theory. And it turned out that the theory didn't really, it was important from a theoretical framework, but it wasn't actually relevant at all to the data or the study itself. And so one could have probably removed that 5 to 10 pages quickly just by removing the theory. So thinking, and I'm not suggesting that you don't have theoretical frameworks. You definitely need them in educational articles. But there's a difference between having 10 pages on the theory, the pros and cons, et cetera, versus referencing it. And maybe if it's unusual or a new theory, you might need to add a paragraph or so. And then the other really important element that journals want to think about in terms of content targeted to the readers, make sure that you're reinforcing the why of the topic and of the study, and reiterate the implications and how this study will has the potential to change the way that we educate students or whatever the topic is. So those are the important things related to content to the reader. So now I'm going to switch gears and talk a little bit about how to parse your project. And I made this schema, so I'm not sure it works 100%, but I was trying to characterize that on the very left-hand side, you've got your dissertation and your capstone. It's 100, 160 pages long, and you're trying to figure out how to parse it out to make articles. So let's say that you have two main discoveries from your dissertation and capstone. And if there's two, now you've split it and it's 75 pages long, which is way too long, still way too long to be submitted to a journal. So is there a way that with those two main discoveries, you can reorganize it to one of the two following ways on the right-hand side of the slide, which is one big topic and two smaller discoveries, so you get 3 papers out of it, or potentially 4 equally important topics from the splitting essentially of the two main discoveries. So the importance of this is that you want to think about how to reorganize all of the work that you did to make sure that you can narrow it down to a smaller article. So the first example I'm going to give is actually an example that's not a dissertation, but it illustrates easily, I think, what I'm trying to say, which is that we did a study to understand the impact of clinical rotations on the what was a new model at the time of patient-centered medical homes. And we decided we wanted to survey students and clinical coordinators to find out what they know about and what they think about patient-centered medical homes. While they were both 15 questions each, they were not the same questions, but we sent them out at the same time. And we got the results back at the same time. So it allowed us to say, what are the key points of these two surveys that have some similarities, some differences across the two groups between the students and the clinical coordinators. And our key points were most programs don't have primary care rotations in patient-centered medical homes. Another thing we learned was that students who rotated in patient-centered medical homes had a stronger interest in primary care practice upon graduation. And finally, when we examined the questions related to the patient-centered medical home teams and roles and how students were integrated and whether or not students were satisfied practicing in that environment, we found also that there was evidence that the students were satisfied, highly satisfied, having been at a place that was a patient-centered medical home. Now you see here that I say thinking about the order. If you think about these 3 key points, Which one should go first? Does anyone have any ideas? Okay, so I will tell you that we were most excited about the idea that students who rotated in primary care, patient-centered medical homes had an increased interest in primary care practice. And we thought that was the most important thing that we learned from these two surveys. But if we started with that, it would be difficult to frame other articles. So one of the other things that we found that was important was most programs don't have primary care rotations in that environment. And while we noted that students who rotated said they wanted to do primary care, we had not documented yet that they were satisfied in that environment. So we started with the first article was mainly about most programs do not have primary care rotations in patient-centered medical homes. And then we next went with the primary care or patient-centered medical homes teams and roles and student satisfaction. And then the last article that we wrote was about students rotating in patient-centered medical homes having high levels of primary care satisfaction and or interest in primary care. And we thought this was the most, number two was actually the most important element because it had the largest opportunity for policy change. Okay, so here's another example. Remember the schema. So the second example is from a dissertation abstract that I found where there was 104 questions in a survey that was given to 314 PAs at with a convenience sample at the AAPA meeting several years ago. And the survey examined PA's use of preventive medicine services in their practice and PA's personal health habits. So they ask questions about the frequency of preventive services provided, the confidence of the PAs who were offering the services, the types of services that were provided, perceived barriers and facilitators to providing the service, and then some questions about the PA's personal health habits themselves. And they wanted to correlate that with whether or not there were preventive services, more preventative services offered. So the study conclusions were that the results of the study can help people make better healthcare decisions. And I use the word people because really it was patients, their families, the clinicians, and even policymakers thinking about what is the connection between preventive medicine and better health. The second conclusion was that it provided a baseline measurement of PAs involved in prevention. And they found in this case that about 50% of the PAs said that they are participate in prevention or recommend prevention activities. And then the other two study conclusions related to advocating for changes in education, certification, and training of PAs and fostering medicine, public health collaborations. So if we think about this, the number two to me was a really good place to start when I'm thinking about what do we want to publish because we don't have it, very little is known. I mean, it's known now, but it wasn't at the time about PA's involvement in preventive medicine and whether or not PAs were recommending it. And they found that about 50% of PAs were involved. They also found that barriers included not having enough education or not having confidence in offering the services. So the next article seems like it would be that we should advocate for changes in education, training, and certification of PAs so that PAs are more confident and more likely to be involved in prevention. And then, if you think about it, in fostering the medicine and public health collaborations, that could be a call to action. And frankly, a call to action article about advocating for changes in education and training could be useful. So some of the data could be repurposed for call to action articles, which are really not research articles, but they're more policy focused articles. And the targets for those are very different in terms of the publication or the journal. So next, thinking about the right journal or the right several journals, one approach that you might want to use is think about the journals that you were citing a lot in your work. And so I'm going to make this up, but let's say there were 50 citations in what you wrote, and it turned out that 25 of them were in health affairs. That means it's a very policy focused journal. And so maybe your work really fits in that venue rather than the venue of JPAE or JAPA, because both of those have very different focuses, both education and clinical practice. So there's a lot of ways to create the list of journals that publish on a topic. You can use Jane, JANE.org as one option. You can also just use Google searches and so on to find these quite easily. And then you want to review the author's instructions. I talked about this before to identify what's the submission type, and there may be a journal section. So, for example, for JPAE, we have specific sections on academic law or lessons learned or educational innovation. So those subsections may have very different guidelines than if it was an original research article. And then read a few of the articles to make sure it fits from that journal. And ask your colleagues and mentors for recommendations is another good way to find the right journal. And then what I recommend is that you choose the top 2 or 3 journals that you think you'd like to submit to, and try to write the article in a way that it fits the author's guidelines for the most part for most of the journals, so that if you you submit it to one journal and it gets rejected, you can, with very little effort, rewrite one section or change something, and then resubmit it to a different journal. So that is all I have in my coffee talk. These are my references, and I will stop sharing, and I think we can open it up for questions.